NATO maintains that it is not directly at war with Russia. The alliance emphasizes its support for Ukraine's right to self-defense, as enshrined in the UN Charter. However, the situation on the ground tells a more complicated story. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine has drawn NATO into a proxy conflict. This conflict has blurred the lines between direct and indirect involvement, raising questions about the potential for a wider European war. NATO walks a fine line in its support for Ukraine. The alliance provides military aid, including weapons, training, and intelligence. This assistance is crucial for Ukraine's defense against Russia's aggression. However, NATO has stopped short of deploying troops or enforcing a no-fly zone over Ukraine. These limitations are intended to avoid direct military confrontation with Russia. NATO members fear escalating the conflict into a full-blown war between nuclear-armed powers. This cautious approach highlights the difficult balance NATO must strike. Russia's narrative of war against the West. Russia frames the conflict in Ukraine as a war against NATO expansionism. Russian state media propagates the narrative that the West is using Ukraine as a proxy to weaken Russia. This narrative serves several purposes for the Kremlin. It aims to rally domestic support for the war by portraying Russia as the victim of Western aggression. It also seeks to undermine Western support for Ukraine by suggesting that NATO, not Russia, is the aggressor. This rhetoric raises concerns about potential miscalculations and escalation. Ukrainian strikes on Russian soil. Ukraine's long-range strikes on targets within Russia further complicate the situation. These strikes, often carried out with weapons supplied by NATO countries, demonstrate Ukraine's ability to hit back at Russia on its own territory. While Ukraine argues that these strikes are legitimate acts of self-defense, Russia views them as escalatory. These attacks increase the risk of Russia retaliating against NATO members directly. They also fuel the Kremlin's narrative that Russia is already at war with the West. The potential for miscalculation and unintended escalation remains high. Poland's strategic location makes it a potential flashpoint in the conflict. As a NATO member bordering Ukraine, Poland plays a vital role in supplying military and humanitarian aid. Russia has repeatedly warned Poland against its support for Ukraine. The Kremlin views Poland's involvement as a direct threat. Any attack on Polish territory would trigger NATO's collective defense clause, potentially escalating the conflict into a wider European war. The situation highlights the precariousness of the current security environment. The Russian public's perception of the war remains a crucial yet unpredictable factor. While state-controlled media dominates the information space, cracks are appearing in the Kremlin's narrative. Growing casualties, economic hardship, and mobilization efforts have taken a toll on public support. It remains unclear how much influence public opinion has on Putin's decision-making. However, any significant erosion of support for the war could limit his options and potentially create pressure for a negotiated settlement. NATO faces the daunting challenge of supporting Ukraine while avoiding a wider war with Russia. The alliance must continue providing Ukraine with the means to defend itself against Russian aggression. Simultaneously, NATO must maintain open channels of communication with Moscow to manage escalation risks. This balancing act requires careful diplomacy, clear communication, and a united front among NATO members. Failure to maintain this delicate balance could have catastrophic consequences for Ukraine, Europe, and the world. The war in Ukraine has brought NATO and Russia closer to direct conflict than at any point since the Cold War. While both sides insist they are not seeking a wider war, the risks of escalation remain high. The situation is fluid and unpredictable, with no easy solutions in sight. The international community must work together to find a peaceful resolution to the conflict. This requires addressing the root causes of the war, including Russia's security concerns and Ukraine's sovereignty. Until a lasting peace is achieved, the world will continue to teeter on the brink of a wider and even more devastating conflict.